am in dialogue with has a commitment to justice, right? They're in the inquiry of justice, and especially in these times, and especially, you know, in the face of the pandemic, in the face of the uprisings, and being where I like to call year one. Year one means, 2019 was 400 years since the enslavement of African peoples on this territory called the United States. And so I think of year one as the one in which we begin to change the narrative, so that we are having a conversation about what it is to go forward from a history that we can't put behind us, as in we can't ignore it, but also like now we are wanting to grapple with it. So many more people, I think, are taking the truth of this history to heart, and to keep it close, and like they're feeling the truth of it. They're feeling the truth of it. They're feeling the impact of it. They're seeing, experiencing the ramifications of it through the overt expression of white supremacy at the highest offices of government, to what it means to have policing, no matter where it is in the nation, that was situated from the onset as being a force that was about entrapping enslaved peoples and returning them to a people that wrongfully owned them. So in the face of that, one of the questions I'm always invited to contemplate is the question of justice, and like what justice is, and how people hold justice in their bodies, in their expression, in what they do, in the face of the fact that we live in a society in which justice has been framed for us in the form of punishment and retribution, power over, right, people that have and get to mete out justice, and people upon whom justice is rendered. And so people really ask the question, and I think are confronting, what does justice look like for this year one and going forward, if we no longer want to inhabit a mindset and a framing, a shaping in our bodies that comes from peoples that have never have really had justice for all of us in mind.
Yeah. The thing listening to you makes me, you mentioned it, and it goes back this idea, first of all, of justice as an inquiry. Mm-hmm. Because I think we take this for granted, but it's not always taken for granted. Justice can be a set of ideas, it can be a set of actions, it can be a set of, we need to focus on certain institutions and make changes. There are things, all these things are important, but justice as an inquiry is a deeper, especially when we bring it into what we mean by that in the Buddhist community. It's something that brings together these other aspects of justice, and what it is to interrogate. You used that word earlier. What is it to interrogate myself, to interrogate my relationships, to think what it is to have a just body with other bodies, what it is to be be behaviorally just with other people. And sometimes in my experience, that can get forgotten when we're focusing on justice, and we end up, as you say, we end up taking on these mechanisms of justice that have more to do with aggression and violence and so on, that maybe don't fully interrogate, at least for me, what it is to be a just force in the world, what it is to be in that way of samyak and so on. So anyway, that thought came up as you were talking, and I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that, and then particularly in the Buddhist community, and I think that we think of, certainly think of, and I draw from the idea of samyak or sammā as a Buddhist idea in terms of where I first approached it. And then, as I shared earlier, I really came into contact with it deeply within the framework of yoga, and seeing like the different ways in which one could interpret this word or end up with this word that had for the entirety up until then of my practice life been interpreted as right. And when I end up with the word right, in my Western, paradigmatic brain, right, what ends up on the other side of that is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the interrogation is, first and foremost, that is just to notice the impulse, right, of like, if there's a right justice or a right, as we have the eightfold path, right, if there's a right understanding and if there's a right view, if there's a right speech, and then there's a wrong one. And really confronting, how deeply ingrained that was for me was part of this initial interrogation to begin to just kind of like reframe my whole way of looking at how I think about things, not just like what I think, but how I think about them, right? Like what's the vector point through which I enter into thinking about them. So I can think about right justice, but what I'm actually even going to say is like, before we get to right justice, like how is it that I think of the word justice to begin with, right? Like where from whence do I think about justice? From whence do I think about rightfulness, or even what that word, means and what it comes from? And for me, this inquiry, for those of us that are committed to not recreating much of the same paradigm, with the pieces on the board shifted around a little bit, with the colors maybe changed, maybe the multiplied colors, if we're really committed to as much as what has come up through even conversations about defunding the police, if we're really committed to reframing, and I dare say absolving ourselves of a commitment to trying to see justice and all the other things we're committed through the lens of systems that have inhabited our interior perspective for so long, right? If we don't do that, right, if we're committed to really shaping our own worlds, we have to be committed to deconstructing the narratives and ideas and framing and shaping that make up the way that we even perceive justice, like even the way we're pursuing justice. And you and I have conversations a lot around the ways in which particularly a lot of the, we've now come to call it like call out culture that exists within progressive spaces, the speed and aggression that inhabits so many of our communities that situate themselves as being about justice, really begs deep interrogation of like, how is it that we think that that's going to bring about whatever it is that we're intending to inhabit at some point in our existence? Ways that we shame people, ways that we marginalize people inside of we marginalize people for the sake of marginalization, right? It's like we get there and we're like, we shame people because they're not necessarily aware of like all the marginalities people we have. We shame them for being in white bodies. We shame them for, not knowing better when so many people have been deeply immersed in cultures of whiteness and white supremacies, brown, black, queer, Asian bodies as well, right? So immersed. And so that we have a knee-jerk reaction to go to shame, to punishment, to ostracizing, to disbelonging, is real evidence of the ways in which we are shaped by these cultures that we have been immersed in. And the high likelihood is that our notions of justice are just as shaped by those cultures.
Yeah, it's great what you bring up, because being somebody who was raised in a conservative white evangelical church, I don't see a lot of difference between the strategies that were used to maintain that culture, that community, and the strategies that are often maintained to create the communities I see sometimes in the social justice world. Exile is a huge piece. You know, and it's sometimes shocking to see the degrees. What I would see, coming from my background, what I would see are strategies of maintaining whiteness that are being used to maintain social justice communities. You know, and to shame people out, to hold on to particular truths that are held by authorities, that then if you don't get them exactly right, or, you know, these kinds of things. So it is this way of understanding a way to maintain a conviction, because I think the conviction is important, right? There's something about conviction that is important, although maybe that word gets messed with a little bit. But not in a way that is about destroying, you know, in some ways destroying others for the sake of that conviction, or the word that's often used now, like canceling each other because of that conviction. So that is that's an interesting nut to crack right now, because it's coming from every direction. It's not just coming from, so it's coming from everywhere. The country's ethos right now is this kind of
canceling.
Yeah. It's you're either with me or you're not with me, and it's a war stance.
It is a war.
It's a war stance, and I get it. I mean, the violence is incredible, and I understand it, but I just don't think it's going to do anything but make it much more difficult to have these conversations. And,
and I think for me, the great, you know, the real question is, and that's where the idea of, you know, right justice emerged in my thinking. It's like, well, how are we thinking about justice, and how, you know, how do we give it some kind of entry point that invites us into the interrogation of how it is that we're holding it? And I think that the sense of right justice is for me that entry point, right? It begs an inquiry, like, right, is that mean, is it fixed? Is there like justice right and justice wrong? And so you know, with this sense of samyak, you do sammā, you have something that is, I like to say, complicated. It gets complicated, right? We complicate the idea of the binaries that so much of our society is situated in. And, you know, when Greg and I were speaking earlier, we were talking about, like, for a long time, we've talked about them as dichotomies. And it struck me at some point, like, oh, you know, in writing Radical Dharma and talking about queerness, and really seeing how queerness is, you know, not just about one's sexuality, not just about one's gender, not just one's gender expression, and so on and so forth. Queerness as a sort of theory, and that's why we call the chapter in the book that I co-authored, Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. The theory of queerness was really about upsetting the binaries, right? And recognizing that that's what queerness it does in terms of its power of disruption. And so therefore that power of disruption is applicable to way more places than the usual assigns of sexuality and gender. And that really opened up a lot for me, because I recognize, oh, this is bit of the, you know, in many ways we think about it in Buddhism, you know, the root of all challenges, right, is the notion of a false self and a separate self, a falsely constructed self that is separate. So that combination. And in this society, that sits in the same way, this notion of the binaries, right, that there is a fixed right and wrong, that there is a fixed good and bad, that there is a fixed just and unjust. And that's not to say that we don't have, you know, real clear sets of, as you said, convictions.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that we don't land somewhere, you know, with real intention to, you know, for instance, to bring to justice the people that murdered Breonna Taylor in her bed, to bring to justice the person that murdered George Floyd, and also stood aside as he was murdered. So we're not talking about some kind of, like, you know, namby-pamby, like, you know, let's kumbaya, just forgive everyone, that kind of thing. but to be willing to be in the interrogation of the finer places, and how we mete out justice, how we expect justice to be meted out. And for me, the central question is like, if we intend justice out of thing, what is it putting forth in the world to carry forward, right? Like whatever we're putting forth in the world, what is going to flourish out of that particular action, right? That is just, or that particular structure that we put in place that we intend to uphold or to uplift justice. And if that seed creates ultimately more suffering and more harm, that then incites a cycle of more suffering and more harm, I no longer believe that I can hold that as just. It may be satisfying. I'm gonna give you that. Really satisfying for a moment, for some long moments. I'm challenged, in my own interrogation with holding that as just any longer. Yeah.
No, it makes me think, what you're saying there in your conversation of binaries makes me think of a binary that I think that we've talked about is really important, which is this, and it's kind of a held binary where they're often not interrogated together, which is seeing the reproduction of oppression or structural violence within institutions, whether we're talking about legal institutions or the police force or whatever we're talking about, and the mind as a place of reproduction of oppression and violence, and how these are often not talked about in the same conversation, and that becomes, I think, our strategies become, our strategies become are not as informed as they could be. It makes me think about, when I think about Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, I mean, one of the things, she wasn't planning to set out to write a Buddhist book, but what's interesting about it is she kind of makes a very clear argument that you can change the institutions, and sometimes the institutions are even seen as progressive, the replacements. But when they're infiltrated by the same commitment to white supremacy, they end up taking on the same organizing strategy in the society as the one before them. And it really clarifies this relationship that we need to be interrogating the way that our internal convictions are in dialogue, relationship, reinforcing relationship with institutions. And that it isn't a situation where we can't just sit and look at ourselves and do nothing about the institutional material world. But at the same time, we're not going to just shift the institutional material world without looking at what's going on for ourselves, because we will cleverly reproduce the same situation again. And anyway, that is one of those binaries that I have listening to, I found very sneaky to keep them apart.
Well, I mean, I think even, not just even like, I mean, certainly, so they're within ourselves, and then we can see that expressed within the cadres of, compañeras that we are moving through the world trying to create justice with. And so we do have these, micro expressions of forms of, oppression, with the sense that, like, in this case, it's appropriate, like, it's like, oh, well, in this case, it's appropriate, and I just said, like, well, if you start, I'll tell you a story. Some years ago, we had this fellow. He was, I used to live with a residential community, and there was a fellow, was like mostly people of color, and a fellow came along, and he was an older man. I think he was, approaching 60 at the time, older white man, Jewish, not practicing Jewish, culturally Jewish, and from New York, and all of the things that sort of go with like being a New York Jew man. He had been in the music industry, so he was accustomed to being paid attention to, and so on and so forth. He comes, in the West Coast, this, largely of color, quite queer, like not all, but like quite queer community. And needless to say, he was he caused some havoc wherever he went. He was also not the most kempt person, and he wasn't particularly sensitive to kind of newer ideas about what it meant to infringe on the space. Never physical, right? Kind of like make his interest in women known, and women that weren't necessarily interested. So he created a lot of kerfluffle. And at some point, one of the folks in the community had been there for a while, came and said to me, like, why do we let him stay here?
Mm.
Like, it's like he's so troublesome, and he's so. And I said, we're a open meditation community space. If I start drawing a line and saying that he can't be here, where do I end the line?
Mm-hmm.
Right? He's made mistakes. He's annoying. He's irritating. And he's never willfully caused harm. He has, been apologetic, and he keeps making mistakes out of his conditioning and all of the things. Where do I draw the line if I say, like, well, you have to go because you don't suit our taste, or you're not convenient, or you're not, you don't make things comfortable for everyone? I said, where do I draw the line? And I said, do I draw the line at lesbians, which she was? Do I draw the line at, Puerto Ricans, which she was? Do I draw the line? Where do I draw the line if that is what I start to do? Because the insularity that we start to create around so-called progressive communities is, as you said to your testimony, can be as oppressive and as unforgiving as any other community I've seen. The difference is that the people look like me, right? Or the people enjoy the same things I do, or people want to talk about the same things I do, or I feel safe within that space. I don't want to have safety in exchange for creating a culture that is, vicious and unforgiving, and unrelentingly ostracizing for other people. I think if we interrogate ourselves more deeply, and the communities, and what the kind of cultures we've created, I think that we would know in our bodies that these are not the kinds of societies we want to create.
Thank you for bringing that up, because you get to something that's very personal in my life. Because if I'm when you're in leadership in a Dharma community that is also focused on social justice, which you have been, and we share this kind of situation, it's an interesting tension, because there is the Dharma community side, which I think can err on the side of a kind of false harmony, a shallow harmony that doesn't actually interrogate and dig down into what's actually going on in the community. So that's one piece of it. But what may be in that community is the possibility of that community is that there's longer term practitioners that are, at least we hope, that are mature enough to hold the kind of difference you're talking about, somebody they really disagree with. On the other side, you have the social justice inclinations, which is much more about, has a little bit of like, everybody needs to get on board, and if they're not using the language we're using, then they're problematic, right? But those people are willing to do the interrogation piece. And so this coming together of those two universes creates this I don't want to go as far to say struggle, but certainly complication where you're trying to understand what it is to cultivate a mature community that can hold somebody in it that isn't really on board with all this stuff, and isn't, it takes a certain maturation to say, yeah, this person is not really on board with us. Can we let them mess up? Can we let them be conditioned? Can we let them say what they say and still have a confidence in ourselves that we're doing this other work that is about um, revealing, interrogating, healing forms of injustice? And I think that confidence piece is interesting to me, because there's a maturity and confidence that's necessary to both do that work and say, this other person who has no clue how to do it is not a threat to us in this environment. We can let them be themselves. And as long as they're taking some responsibility, so anyway, I just throw that out there because I think it's an interesting challenge right now in what it is to think about and cultivate community.
Mhm. Yeah, I was hearing you talk about the confidence, and it begs the question of like, what is the ill confidence, right? That can't
Yeah.
allow for someone to, not have said the right thing, or that can't allow for someone to be on a different, different page and a different point in their learning curve. I mean, certainly is really present for many of us right now is the fact of race, and a lot of white-bodied people are figuring out where they are. They're sort of like waking up, and sure, it's annoying. Like, right, it's annoying. I'm a brown, like a mixed race, mixed heritage, identify as Black, and so it's annoying to feel like, well, where the hell were you? Like, how could you just be discovering this now? And we are in a bodies. We're in bodies, and bodies are process. Bodies are processes like that. Bodies are nothing else but ongoing processes. And those of us that have been immersed in the witness of white supremacist cultural realities, right? Like the culture of whiteness that hides white supremacy, right? So I always talk about whiteness as the culture by which white supremacist values and ideologies are upheld implicitly, right? So nobody's walking around going, "Hey, I want to be," except the dude in the White House. "Hey, I want to be a white supremacist," right? So, but whiteness as a culture is there to just like uphold those values, right? In a, um, the folks that do undoing racism talk about excuse me, face there's another one, and I forget their name right now, but they talk about facially neutral but not racially neutral, right? And so a lot of whiteness culture is facially neutral, right? It appears neutral on its face by deferring to white supremacist values, but of course it's not racially neutral. And uh, the truth is, in any given situation, whether that is intimate relationships, whether that's relationships with your children, whether it's relationship with your partners, we are at different places in our process. And so for many white-bodied people and brown people, brown people, mixed race people, to come into the reality, just like boom, whoa, I've been, as Resmaa Menakem says, white adjacent, like, right? Like, it's like, I've been like so steeped in this, I didn't even know that I was, playing out whiteness, right? That I was like expressing whiteness. I mean, we're all sort of like learning. It's like, oh my goodness, this fixation on time, whiteness. Whoa, this, this perfectionism thing, whiteness. Oh, this, so and so and so. You could kind of like, rattle all the things down. And people are struck. I'm here to tell you that like they can get the whole checklist, and it's not going to change their ability. It's not going to change their process, right? Of being able to really get how those things are playing out in their lives, how they've been playing out in their lives, and how and the speed and the momentum of a life that is, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years in play, 60 years in play. But you're not going to stop the momentum of those behaviors, associations, ways of being. When I think of associations, I think, for instance, of, the entire complete universe of trans gender realities, like entering into our awareness. And I have said to people many times, I have absolutely no problem whatsoever in however people want to be called, understand, reflected, have themselves known and received. That makes absolute sense to me. If someone says, like, this is, like Ty Cole says, like, call me by my true names, right? Like, it's like somebody's name, like whatever it is. And I cannot deny that I have, at the time at which I came into real understanding of trans folks, and pronouns became a thing. I remember I was kind of away in my spiritual life, and I went to an event, and we went around the circle, and I was part of this thing, and it was somatics and social justice, and we went around the circle, and I was sort of come out of my sort of spiritual world and cave that I had been living in. I was sitting there, and we were going around circle, and I'm listening, and they said, okay, say your name and where you're from, and they said, and your pronoun, and I was like, what? Just I wasn't this wasn't like 100 years ago. I was grown, and I was like, and I was grown, and I have been in social justice, and I have been in since my before I was 20. Yeah. Politicized. And so, but there's a point at which a thing is new for you, it's new for you. Yeah. And so I had to tell people, I have whatever by that time, 40 years of speed of associating people according to the associations that I have inherited. And so even with a practice, right, it was going to take a moment for me to stop my mouth, stop my brain, right, first, and then my mouth from saying she by association and thereby misgendering people. It wasn't like I was trying to misgender them for them. I was misgendering them for me. I was like, I'm not trying to misgender you. I'm misgendering you in my own brain, because my brain has this momentum of 40 years of training. And I can remember my dad's going like, no, that she, and I'd misgender people when I was a kid, call people he and she, the other way around. And my dad was like, no, that she, that's he. We've got momentum. So we've got momentum around gender. We've got momentum around race. We have momentum around our biases. We have momentum around our fears. We have, and it's easy for us in the sort of progressive world to think those are justified, right? If I look over my shoulder and I see a white man, and like, that's justified momentum and fear. And, Greg, I could be walking around with you with your big old bald head and everything and be like, that's justified, right? Like, I could look at this guy and so, like, it's justified for me to have some fear creep up around him and then feel like, oh, like, he is the gentlest, sweetest, feminist, anti-racist, person I've ever white man in a white male body that I've ever come across. 6'2", right? Like, big body, like all of that. And some of the people, that's justified. But then we don't want it to be justified, right? To hold gender in a particular way. We don't want to be justified that white folks will have, microaggressive thoughts before they can even stop themselves. I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying that it is complex. Yeah. And that if our only mechanism for reconciling, for working with it, is to take on the habits and the ways of our oppressors, to solve the dilemma of the historic injustice, I don't think what we have is right justice.
You know, thank you. And listening to that, I was thinking of a conversation we were having before around what gets, one of the core things that gets in the way of that change, that intimate, it's a very intimate, vulnerable transformation, all of that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
It's embarrassing, it's everything. Um,
Yeah, don't get shame in there.
that's where I'm going, is like, is there is this thing that is in our country and in our country's culture that has to do, and we can talk about where it comes from. Probably the Puritans had a big part of it, but there is this piece of irredeemability,
Mm-hmm.
right? That there is something that when we do something, that when we say something, that when we have difficulty changing, it isn't the conversation is not about our action, our behavior. The conversation is about each other as a being.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that often, this is what's behind white folks' defensiveness, is that it goes straight to I'm awful, not I need to take responsibility for my behavior and transition, but there's something irredeemable about me. To use very Christian, my soul is rotten. That kind of, it goes all the way so fast into
Mm-hmm.
this shame space, and
Well,
to heal that mistake and not reinforce it, to not use
yeah.
language that reinforces it, to not cultivate cultures that reinforce this idea that drives somebody into a corner and makes and reinforces their belief they already have that they're rotten to the core. This seems to be a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and the truth is that any animal, when you push them into a corner, they're either going to cave or they're either going to collapse or they're going to fight back, right?
Yeah.
And so, depending on where people are situated and located socially, even if they want to be in a different place about it, if what they're up against is an existential crisis, because that's what you're talking about, right? That you make a mistake, an existential crisis, which was the method of um, controlling people that was expressed and exhibited and built into the structure of Puritan culture, that's built into this, the structure of a society that operates by punishment, is the only way you can control people, right, is to have them have deeply ingrained in them the sense of they will not survive their any of their impulses that go against the grain of this culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Now that, depending on who gets to define what those impulses are, right, those impulses could be something like, you will not get to survive your impulse to love a Black woman if you're a white man. You will not get to survive your impulse to be aligned with and support that enslaved African that you are also in indentured servitude with. You will not get to survive your impulse to align with your sense of humanity, decency, and compassion by resisting the whole idea of people being enslaved. Hence abolitionists were it was demanded of them that if they wanted to be citizens of the newly forming United States, that they had to disavow themselves of their connection and to enslaved African peoples and their commitment to seeing all people be free. So it's not like these impulses are like inherently negative. Those impulses get defined, and inside of our progressive cultures and subcultures and systems, there's a real question for us of like, who is defining that, right? Like, who is doing that defining that then determines the margins of the mainstream within our subcultures, right? Or as Gloria Adazula would say, like, and the borderlands, right? That we're creating new borderlands within our own communities. the question for me is, can we survive that? Right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
right? Can we survive that? Can any of us consider ourselves, right and righteous enough to survive the many lines that we can create around so-called right and wrong? And I'm actually like love, to that end, for you to talk a little bit about right, and about that idea of right in right justice. Like how do you hold that and look at that?
Yeah. Um,
Especially being a Dharma teacher, especially being a person that I imagine people look to figure out what's right, and including people that take vows to follow a path that is littered with this word right. For those of you that don't know, the eightfold path of the historic Buddhist teachings is the all of the words are preceded by the word right, and is kind of what brought me to this question of right thought, and right mindfulness, and right livelihood, right effort, and right speech. So I have to say something about that, but go ahead first.
no, I think it's great. I think the thing that is, it's an ongoing process for me. But I would say that where I am with it is so much about feeling into my body's sense of harm.
Mm.
And when my body knows, when I'm not wrapped up, when I don't get wrapped up in my intellectual understanding what I think is the right thing in the world, which is there, and I need it, and I use it to discern, but to really feel into, my body knows when I've caused another body to attack itself, to feel fear, to all of these things. I can feel it. If I'm in touch with my body, I can feel it. So this is a very interpersonal way, which is to really to take issues of justice, to take issues of harm, and to drop them into a body and say, what is the bodily wisdom around these issues? And it's quite clear in the body, in terms of, for me, it's quite clear that you don't put together a system to cultivate a safe and just world that puts people in tens of thousands of cages. Like, that's just not, that is quite clear for me. It isn't an intellectual thought. I let my body feel what it is to be in that situation. Would I be bettered as a human being if I were trapped in a cage and put there, and then when you do use discernment and you look and see, okay, and there's the people who are mostly put in prisons look a certain way and are from a certain economic group, well, then that adds even more to the question of what's going on. So I think there's that piece of it. And then anytime I'm interacting with someone, I drop the question of justice in, and I drop the question of harm in together. Mm. It's really important for me to ask those two questions together. Mm. Because justice can so veer away from our concern for harming another person, because I'm right in this sense that we think we have the answer. Mm. So in that sense, I think of rightness very much. I think of rightness in the sense of the equality piece you brought up, in the sense of sammā, as a kind of balance, and including the person as me, and coming from that place, because the person is, there isn't, I think, being this far along in practice, I am under no delusion that other people are separate in any. People are in different perspectives, different situations, different realities, but ultimately separate? No. Their hearts are my heart. So I think there's just all that's in there. It's a very clunky description, because so much of it is so bodily and visceral, it's hard to describe at this point. Yeah. Yeah,
I want to just say something briefly about right, because for me, having grown up in the Buddhist world and like having samyak and we didn't even do translations early on. We just like had just had, it was like write this and write that and write effort, and so we just end up with the binary because that's where the Western mind goes. And it was through my venturing into yoga and eventually became a yoga teacher. And as I said, we had this posture of, a lot of people refer to it as mountain pose, right? And in the tradition that I learned in, samasthiti was also used in addition to tadasana or mountain pose. So samasthiti meant equal standing. So sammā was equal. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's the same sammā? Like, it seems like sammā, right? It's like, it's samyak, it's equal. And I just want to invite everyone to think of this equal, right? Like equal to justice, right? True, real, like equal, like, not just like justice, but right justice, like justice that is like, it's complete. It's very much the way we think about radical Dharma, right? Like a complete justice, but also that one becomes that, right? Like one becomes equal to that, right? That you're, it's not just an objectified, there's a justice over there somewhere to do, right? But and the justice is to be meted out. But in the way that you're talking about, Greg, that like justice is in your body. So it's not a prescription. It doesn't come from someplace that's outside of an interrogation of one's own, feeling and being able to feel into that. And part of what is required is to be in relationship with the body, and as you were saying, you were speaking, I was thinking, very much about, what I have often said to people is that the process and the unfolding of racialization in this country did along the binaries, right, against the binaries of Black and white, that it disemboweled Black peoples, right, through the violence, aggression, harm, but it disembodied white people.
Yeah.
Right. So that these two things, and that we live inside of that persistent those persistent forms of disenfranchisement, right, from reality, so that we're kept from engaging one another, we're kept from engaging ourselves, we're kept from engaging our sense of wholeness and our sense of justice as a result of those two stratified locations, right? And if you think about it, you can see the way that is expressed over and over again, right? That fundamental divide, right, of being either disemboweled, right, like either gutted, right, literally gutted for your ability to thrive, gutted for your ability to, live in harmony, to live in sense of safety, to just live, to just live in a sense of like ease in your own body, right? Or to actually live in your body as a white-bodied person, because what it takes to ignore the reality around you so that you can be 50 years of momentum in your life and then just be coming into the recognition that, like, yeah, we have, white supremacists, and I don't say racist anymore, because like racist, I feel like racist just lets us off the hook. Racism is a condition, right? Racism is the condition of the illness of white supremacy, right? Racism is the condition and the outcome of the fundamental problem of the white supremacist ideology and psychopathy. And so I really invite us to, to all in our communities that intend towards life affirmation, that intend towards thriving, that intend towards wholeness for ourselves, to interrogate, like, if we took the conditions that we're creating inside of our microcosm of communities and circles and relationships, and we extended them out onto the world scene, could we survive them? Who could survive them? Who could not survive them? Right? And so we can see a little bit of what it is we might be creating in that in that larger ecosystem, and then bring it back to ourselves and say, could you survive it? Right? Could you survive it in your own interior life? And I know we want to take questions, but there was something we were talking about earlier, and I don't want to I don't want to go in there, but because you brought it up, and I was like, oh, that is so good. We were talking about the question of like redemption, and in the preparation for the call, and part of what's been missing from our society. Would you speak to
Say
that?
a little bit about redemption.
Well, we were talking about the J word.
Oh yeah. That I'm right there. I was thinking about it myself. Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me, so as I've been doing this for a while, the thing that when we have these conversations and it gets difficult, and your point about disembodiment and disembowelment, I think is so important, because I think one of the things that keeps people in disembodiment is a fear that they will move into the realm of disembowelment, whether they will or not. But there's an unconscious knowledge that is really keeping things together. And
yeah, I would say unepigenetic. I think this is beyond. I'm like, I don't think this is. I like this is it's embodied. I think it's in people's bodies.
Yeah. But the thing that has been so key for me is the role of joy in this, and that when there are these, and we laugh, when we're together, half the time we're talking about all of this, we're laughing, and it's a mess, right? And we're laughing anyway, and it's because in the difficulty, in the conflict, in the terror of entering into these conversations, there's a jubilance that can exist. And the thing that strikes me is that the Buddha talked about 4 unworldly feelings. He talked about equanimity, freedom, ease or peace, and joy. And this is so relevant to what we're doing, right? I mean, this idea, and by unworldly meaning that it's not tied to a particular experience or an object of perception. It's free of the situation you're in. And this is something that I see that has come about in me, and I see in you, and I see in longer term people who've been doing this for a while, is that the joy is not about the situation. It's not joy. It's a joy. It's a reserve that is beyond the conditions of the situation, that is clear to me, so necessary for transformation, for survival, for our humanity to come forward into conversation with each other. So anyway, that was that I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too, because I just feel we need to spend time cultivating that as communities, as people who are in the struggle for social justice. Without joy, I don't know if we'll survive this work, if we'll even be able to do it in a deep and meaningful way. It's too hard.
Yeah, I mean, I won't, Simone. I'll let people ask questions or things, but I would say that I don't think it's possible for us to survive, and I think that that's precisely part of the design of the structures of unforgivingness, of lack of redeemability, cultures that create a sense of lack of redeemability. I think that is part and parcel of the design of oppression and domination. And not only may we not survive, we will not survive. We will not survive if we cannot find out. I don't mean just how to laugh at things, right? I mean to have joy, right, and to entertain joy as part of our understanding of what it means to be free.
Yeah, and just one last thing before we take questions, because you pointed to it, which is this connection of joy and forgiveness that was in that was in what you just framed, which I think is just so critical, that forgiveness and joy can live together in freedom in a way that's just critical. So I'll shut up because I want to hear other folks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for that. Yeah, so much. There's so much. Um, so for those of you who have questions, if you'd like me to read your question aloud, you can put it in the Q&A chat box, which is separate from the chat. It says Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And if you would like to come on screen and speak to Reverend Angel and Kosin, you can raise your hand. And you can do that by going to the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and then a side panel will pop up, and at the bottom of that you'll see the option to raise your hand, and then I'll let you know when it'll be your turn, and you'll pop up on screen. So as people are thinking about questions, I'll read one that's already here that you already actually both of you addressed a little bit, but if you could say more about, like, how do you decide when someone is too repeatedly harmful to other people to remain welcome in open meetings? Is there a way to continue to try to serve abusive people without asking too much of others?
Yeah, I think that we use the notion of caucuses particularly in situations in which there's social location is involved, right? And by social location, often we think about social location in terms of race, but it's also in terms of gender, right? People that have had access to dominant social locations as opposed to people that have had access to have been marginalized within dominant cultures. So but caucusing can be applied at other levels, right? Like other levels of a function of people that have more experience and spaciousness and capacity to navigate people that are challenging. I want to be clear, he was never abusive, he was annoying. And I think that that's part of the challenge we have also, that, we have really collapsed the idea of harm and hurt. There's harm, and there's harm, and we have hurt feelings, hurt experiences, annoying things, and we've just, made everything harm, right? It's all harm. And there is a way that, if you can, I said, like, if you can rub this finger, right, and like it's not bothersome, but if I keep rubbing it and I keep rubbing, I can rub the skin so thin, right, that it starts to hurt. And if I keep rubbing it, it will become harm. So I understand, as a person that's in my body, right, is it a female body, is a queer body, is in a Black body, that is in, like, a person that has, like, experienced lack of ability, reduced, capacity, mental capacity, all of the things that a person has been abused. I understand harm. And I understand harm, not just direct and acute harm, but I also understand ongoing experience of low-level trauma that gives rise to particular instances of things feeling harmful, even though it seems disproportionate to the current time space. So I'm not dismissing those things. I'm saying that sometimes in our woundedness, that we can be quick to grab harm and weaponize harm as a way to get back, right? To get back, to kind of claw back some of our own sense of what has been lost from us as a result of the things that have happened to us. And I just want to say that we do ourselves no service when we abdicate our responsibility for ourselves to distinguish and to keep refine the distinction between harm and hurt, right? That if we weaponize ideas of harm, we will not be able to really find justice for things that are truly harmful, because we would have frittered it away, right, on mere hurts. So in that question of abuse, I think that there is ways to sort out communities so that the people that have more tolerance and more space and more capacity to navigate folks that are difficult in the whatever various ways. I think one of the things that happens with progressive communities, we always think we have to do everything together. We don't. We don't. We just don't. We don't have to do everything together. We don't have to all be there in the same pool at the same time. And sometimes love is distance is an expression of love. That's what I'll say.
Yeah. And I'll just only add a couple of things. One is, I think when somebody is causing harm in a community, it's really important to see where that harm is coming from. And a lot of Dharma communities are not always so great about ensuring that people who cause harm are not in positions of power. It's one thing for them to be in the community and the community to hold them. It's another thing for somebody who has conditioning that is prone to harm to have power. So I think we just have to be aware of what their relationship is to the rest of the community. And I'm way about what Reverend Angel says about we don't have to be in the same spaces. Sometimes things happen and we need to break away from each other for a little bit and have conversations not together in order to make sense out of that and heal things and so on. So that's it. That's all I'll say.
Please go ahead, Dr. T.
Is someone speaking?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Apparently it won't work if I have the headphone on. So my question, I've been listening to this conversation with one question in mind. Mm-hmm. How does this conversation go differently in a Buddhist community than it might in a Christian community or a secular social justice community? And so many of the factors that are being discussed and are wrestled with are really almost indistinguishable. I mean, we all live in the same world, so I shouldn't be surprised, right? We're not actually little holes isolated from each other. But my question is, what is it in the very idea or notion of dharma that might inflect all of this differently? Or pressure it differently than, say, the word justice left to itself, you know, borrowed either from a Christian or a sort of liberal social justice framework. And I would love to hear more about it. I get the feeling that it might have partly to do with how all this is practiced in an embodied way. That's one key thing that I've heard that probably wouldn't be picked up in these other circles, but I would just be eager to hear more.
Do you want to take that, Angel?
Sure. Yes, certainly I would start with the understanding. I don't know. Let me just say that I do believe that that Greg and I, Kosen and I, are in perhaps not in the majority in white Western Buddhist communities around embodiment. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think that we both, part of our, discourse with each other, our ongoing friendship, discourse of friendship is about embodiment and how embodiment does get missed actually in white-centric Western Buddhist communities. So I think that that's one thing. Some folks get it, thank goodness. I also think the notion of interrogation, right? So I think the willingness, I think that there is an absolutism that inhabits much of our white supremacist embedded Christian or notions, as well as our justice notions, even our social justice community. So I think these communities having, there's lots of different permutations of these communities, of course. So this is a rash generalization, but I think having we're talking about Christian communities in the West and in the United States predominantly. And so out of that, I think that so much of this country is steeped in a not just white supremacist, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant worldview, and that worldview permeates the orientation of Christianity that gets the most space, and the orientation of Judaism that gets the most space, and the orientation. So right, it's like the as long as they're inflecting upon the dominant culture, then they get the most space and breadth in the space, and that includes social justice communities. And so that it's so far from our social justice communities to have the notions of forgiveness, to have the notions of redemption, to have the notions of love, to have them those things permeate, to have spirituality permeate, is part and parcel of having been situated, been seated within the overall overarching context of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, I think. And the supremacist domination centric unforgivability, unredeemable ideology that is part of that worldview.
Yeah, and in terms, John, in terms of your question around Dharma, I think in terms of practice, in terms of the Buddha Dharma, I think this is in alignment with what Reverend Angel brought up around absolutism, which is there's not a feeling, there's not a sense, at least for me and in terms of a mature Buddhist practice, that I have some access to a truth that I can hold on to as my own. Like, I don't know what there's not the truth in the sense of like, I have a set of words and beliefs that are the thing that is transcendent that I'm defending and fighting for. It just isn't that orientation as a way of being, that there's much more of a focus on understanding, and this can get in the way when it's not deep, but there's much more of an orientation towards what it is to harmonize a community and get into what it is to harmonize a community. To Reverend Angel's point earlier about how to deal with this guy who's annoying, right? It's not about finding the truth and figuring out who's on the side of truth and who's not. It's about understanding what harmony is in that situation, what it is to. So I think that's just maybe a slightly different orientation around Sangha that has a big effect on the way that we come at these questions, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to add quickly that that all of these things are inflected, right? Or has to do with, certainly who I am, right? Like,
yeah.
I always tell people, like, so I'm Buddhist, but but I'm a lot of like Black and Buddhist in America, right? Which means that I'm steeped in Christianity, and I'm a New Yorker, so like I'm also steeped in in Jewish sensibilities, like I'm steeped in all of those things, and my Dharma doesn't take away from the fact that all of those things are also part of who I am. We're all, we're at least our generation, we're all converts. And so our conversion means that we're fully, we come with the momentum and the speed of our own, historic and, familial paths as well. We don't get to be just Buddhist.
All right, thank you for that. And I'm wondering if you, Reverend Angel and Kosin, would be open to one more question. We're getting close to time.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll bring Sila on.
Hi, Reverend Angel and Kosin. Thank you so much for today. My question is, I guess the crux of it goes something like, how do you find time lands on you as you think about or live justice work. So like living, we've talked a lot about embodiment, just our very nitty gritty down to earth human lives. And there's a certain necessary time component to that. It has its limitations, things of it, there's speeds, momentum, all that. And then there is the time of our spiritual practice almost where it's much more transcendent. There doesn't seem to be any rush whatsoever when you're all the way back, and it almost can feel like our lives go between the two. And when we're talking about justice and harm, there can feel a sense of urgency, a sense of wanting to help as many people as possible, as quickly and effectively as possible. So yeah, I'm just curious how you feel about all that. Thank you.
You first, Kosin.
Okay. I think for me, if the urgency is not infused with that timeless silence, then I run into trouble. So it's not that I don't feel it as a moving back and forth so much anymore, but that I need the way that I feel into this is that my body has a deep relationship with the earth that gives me a particular sense of time. There's an ancestral mind that is present, that is connected to a sense of ancestry and what it is to be supported by ancestors, that has a much longer sense of time. And if those aren't present in my urgency, then my urgency becomes stupid, neurotic, fast, not careful, not wise. And I think I always have to check in and ensure that I'm really rooted in Mother Earth, rooted in the patience that I feel in rivers and trees and life, and rooted in the thoughtfulness of ancestry around my actions that's there. Otherwise, I think my work of social justice becomes very, very confused. And so sometimes you have to take space because you get hit with so much and you need to root back in that again. And then sometimes we've rooted in that long enough and we need to get ourselves out and connecting to things. So it's about, again, body's so involved in being the tissue that connects all of that.
Thank you for that question. Kosin and I hold sort of similar sense of that willingness to pivot into the way I would say, the boundlessness of time, right? That's what you're saying, Sila, the boundlessness of time that one gets the taste of in formal practice, and also I think if we are choosing to take formal practice off of cushions and mats and all of those kinds of things, that we begin to infuse throughout our lives, right? There's moments, I think in many ways, the reason we sit on cushions and so on is not because that's a practice, it's because there's glimpses of that transcendent time-space relationship that we then formalize into a practice, right? That gets formalized. So really that practice of meeting time, space, and transcending time, space, right? So in those moments, you're just transcending that time, space binary of fixed and limited and and just this and mine and all of the things that we do to time. We can litter our lives with that, infuse our our lives with that by way of the habit of being able to drop it in, right? To call that in. So for me, when I feel the urgency or speed, right? Like I have the settle in, right? I can feel that on my body. I can feel the thrust, the push, the move, and settle in. And simultaneously, that drops me out of what I think of as a kind of arrogance, right? That, like I can do it all. So and that it is all of mine to do, because there's an arrogance in that, right? That we can hide behind, yeah, but I feel so bad for people, or like, you know, there's so much harm and suffering. Well, if there's so much harm and suffering, it can't possibly be all of yours to fix and to do. And I am, you know, speaking of ancestors, and I've shared this in a conversation I was having that's, you know, online somewhere. You know, I'm my ancestors' proof. I'm my ancestors' proof of the power of time, right? And that time is not mine. You know, and so I think of myself as time shifting all the time. I time bend. I talk about it in the community that I sit with many mornings. We have sits most mornings, and I talk about it as time bending, and that we have to learn to time bend, whereby we drop our fixation on time as something that that we own, or that we're limited by, that is limited. You know, time just is. It doesn't have, it's not like looking at us, you know, trying to figure out what to do with us. It's not trying to ruin us. It's not trying to, you know, keep us from having things. That time just is. And so if we can be just is inside of time, we bend it, and we feel the profound as it isness. Mm-hmm. You know, just the as it isness. When we allow ourselves to be in time, right? Not to be against time. To be in time is to not be against it, is to not turn around and look over our shoulder. And none of us stay there, right? We have hopes and dreams and aspirations, and you know, corrections that need to be made, and things that are asunder, that need to be brought upright. But if we have close companionship with the transcendence of being in time, the maniacal aggression of being out of time and out of relationship with our bodies, and out of right sense of both the total urgency of it, and also the in its own timeness of it, that they coexist, and that they have to, and really to do anything else. And this brings us right back to the beginning of our conversation, to try to force anything else, we can feel the harm, the injustice of that in our bodies.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.
If I may, I'm doing a conversation. I know I had the conversation, and I'm going to invite Kosin to at some point do I call it a tear down of this conversation that I had with Resmaa Menakem, and I want to drop that in the chat too, to invite people, because we're going to do a rescreening of that question with a Q&A. And then at some point, so if you get to see that conversation, I'm going to grab Kosin to do what I was going to say, a tear down, kind of a looking at the conversation that's happening between two Black folks that really are deeply talking about, you know, the nature of somatics in the body, and racialization and its impact on bodies. So I want to just invite, you know, the Dharma loving, interested community to come and check out this conversation with us, because it will be kind of a thread. And I want to bring, I so love talking to Kosin, and I so love being in this kind of space with you, that I want to be back in this space. And so start it right here. So if people would join us, that'd be fantastic.
I'm excited for that. Thank you. So I think we've come to time. And Peace, I don't know if you want to say anything, but otherwise I'll just say thank you very much thank you, Reverend Angel, for being here. Love being with you always.
I love being with you.
And
Isn't he the best? Isn't he the best?
I just mirror who I'm with.
Well, let's Let's hope that's not always true.
Yes, and the next dialogue that we'll have together will be October 27th with Lama Rod Owens. So we'll continue these conversations and dialogues further and further. Oh, Kosin's using all his chips.
Yeah, exactly. I'm pulling them all in.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much.
To you.